From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Each episode is recorded in front of a live audience at Rice University. Today's topic, the Iraq War. Today I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, Fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute.
Delighted to be here, Ambassador. Let's dive in. In March 2003, the US invaded Iraq. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of the invasion. As someone who worked directly on this issue, can you walk us through the thinking process in the George W. Bush administration that got us from 9/11 to Iraq?
Kristian, to understand the process that took us from the tragedy of the Twin Towers, Pentagon, and that field in Pennsylvania to the invasion of Iraq and all that came after, we've got to go a bit further back in time. At the beginning of the Clinton administration in 1993, a policy which we referred to at the time as dual containment was articulated. And the basic premise of dual containment isn't difficult to understand. It is a critical partner U.S. effort to restrict the flow of conventional and the technologies for non-conventional nuclear, CW, BW weapons to both Iran and Iraq. It was a pivot away from the previous Twin Pillars approach to managing Gulf security, or to the policy that evolved in the ending years of the Iraq-Iran war of siding essentially with Iraq and providing it with military support as a counter to Iran. These previous policies were seen as having failed, and a containment policy was articulated at the time, coming shortly after the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait as a means without U.S. boots on the ground or heavy investment of national treasure to do what was most important: constrain the ability to further acquire conventional or non-conventional weaponry for both of the threatening states in the region. That policy, however, was challenged from the very beginning by those in the administration and policy community outside who demanded an end game, who were not comfortable with an ongoing containment strategy, and instead wished to know how long would this go on, when did it end? Now, the United States and its key global partners had completed decades of what amounted to a containment strategy against the former Soviet Union, and it had ended with a success. But the manner in which the Cold War ended, the dramatic events of Eastern Europe's freeing itself almost overnight, country by country, from the Soviet Iron Curtain in 89-90, the fall of the Soviet Union 90-91, had created a sense that history, as has been written, had ended, and decisive outcomes, sweeping conclusions, were to be the product of policy. This took us from a containment policy in which the end game, as was explained to national security advisors and presidents at the time by I and my colleagues, was simply another day, another week, another month in which neither Iraq or Iran could acquire threatening capabilities. That was the end game in itself. That switched rapidly to Madeleine Albright's Georgetown University speech, in which regime change became the end game. And it's important to recall that, and I've dwelt on this at some length, because 2001 and then 2003, the invasion, were the product of a demand for a decisive resolution to the problem of Iraq. And that resolution, even articulated by a senior Democrat, not Republican, was regime change.
And how did policy perceptions of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein change after 9/11 itself?
The United States intelligence community, along with the intelligence communities of all of our allies, concluded that, in fact, after the end of the Gulf War, Saddam had not ended his non-conventional weapons program. Why was this the case? Was it a deliberate concoction by the Bush administration to justify going to war? No. We believed genuinely, and we believed almost universally and uniformly, as did our allies, that he had WMD, weapons of mass destruction. History has been often rewritten, modified. I was there. I can assure you, only a handful of outliers question this. Why? Because Saddam had done too good a job of convincing his neighbors, Iran, the Gulf, and the world, as a means of preserving his regime and power projection, that he had something that, in fact, we later learned after the invasion, he had in fact dispensed with. He, in many ways, in his own clever deception, done too good a job. But it was not a willful misleading of the American people or the world. We made a mistake in judgment.
And was there any recognition of how the impact of sanctions on Iraqi society between 1991 and 2003 had raised the risk of fragmentation along sectarian, religious, or tribal lines? Was there, in fact, any such impact?
Kristian, there was deep thought given by those who prepared the famous Perfect Storm memorandum, authored by now CIA Director, then Near East Assistant Secretary of State, Bill Burns, and our team, pointing out the problems which an invasion of Iraq, overthrow of Saddam, would predictably generate, including the fissuring of Iraq along its existent sectarian and ethnic lines. Your question as to whether the sanctions policy exacerbated these fissures, it may well have, but very frankly, those fissures were so great, so kept under control only by the brutal repression of Saddam, his family, and his regime, that whatever contributions the sanctions may have made were minor and in the end not determinative.
And Saddam Hussein fell in less than 3 weeks in 2003, but coalition forces soon faced a growing insurgency. Was any one factor more central to the deterioration of conditions, or was there a range of issues at play?
Well, there was a range of issues at play, but you have to assign priorities to what had the greatest weight. It was our entry into not just an occupation of a foreign state with the sectarian and ethnic dividing lines that I noted, but our attempt to construct, I do not use the term reconstruct, to construct a new socio-political entity in a geographic space, Iraq, where the concepts we were attempting to introduce were wholly or largely absent from the country's political, social, economic past. Complicating that extraordinarily high mountain to climb was the disbandment of the Iraqi armed forces and the pursuit of the de-Baathification campaign. I think, broadly speaking, the literature shows of all single steps which most contributed to the debacle that became post-2003 was the disbandment of the armed forces and de-Baathification. It was the drawing of the parallel between Baathi Party membership and Sunnis, incorrect. Many Shia were Baath Party members as well, and then between Baath Party members, Sunni or Shia, and Saddamists. Not all Baathis were Sunnis, not all of them were Saddamists, but we made a sweeping judgment. The Baathists were the Nazis, and just as in 1945 and beyond we denazified Germany, so we would denazify Iraq, to our peril and tragedy.
And in 2005, the Saudi Foreign Minister, Saud al-Faisal, told the Council on Foreign Relations that coalition policies in Iraq had the effect, quote, of handing the whole country over to Iran, end quote. Was there a misreading by the US or by Saudi Arabia of sectarian politics or regional outcomes in the empowerment of a new political class in Baghdad?
Kristian, the actual phrases, because they were used on multiple opportunities, was handing over Iraq to Iran on a silver or a golden platter. It was even more dramatic than your quotes. And I'll address this from both the aspects you raise. Did we misunderstand? Yes, we did, fundamentally. We did not realize that in the overturning of Saddam, we did more than simply take an incredibly brutal, if not psychopathic, leader and his family and remove them from power. We overturned the order of the universe for many in the Arab world for whom Sunni rule over Iraq was eternally destined and eternally to be preserved. This is a very alien thing for us to grasp. But the division between Shia and Sunni in the Middle East was so profound, both exacerbated by Iranian policies and pre-existent historically, culturally, religiously, from actual policy decisions by Iran. What we effectively did was upset what had been a predictable state of affairs which was intended divinely to continue forever. We turned the world upside down. Now the Saudis. I had a notable conversation with the late King Abdullah, which I recall quite well. It was a very lengthy conversation. Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal was present for this discussion. King Abdullah said, "I have warned you against the consequences of what you have done. You have not listened. Your ears are blocked. And so I have no longer any interest in speaking further to you, that is the US government, on this issue. You have given Iraq to the Safawiyin." He wouldn't even use the term Shia or Persians. He was referring to the dynasty in Persian, which converted the country formally to Shia Islam in the 1700s. This is how profound, on the part of the Saudis, the overturning of order, the upset had been. He said, "I have one recommendation to you. Erase the Constitution, start again, and install appropriate governance," by which he meant Saudi-approved politicians who would correct the disordering of affairs. And there were several such at the time. The Saudis themselves contributed actively in those years to enhancing Iran's role by refusing to engage positively to support. But that is a policy which transformed itself after Abdullah's passing. And the Saudi role has been quite constructive in Iraq after. But I'm recreating for you the profound dissonance we had at that time.
Thank you. And you spent a year in Iraq between May 2005 and May 2006.
Oh, I spent much of the next 3 years in Iraq as well.
As Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission, and then you served as the State Department's coordinator for Iraq for the remainder of the Bush presidency and the beginning of the Obama administration, when Iraq was a major policy priority. What were some of the major issues the Bush administration got right?
The Bush administration, and I'll be direct, President Bush made what history will judge to be the correct decision with respect to the surge in 2007. And I say that as an acknowledgement of the rightness retrospectively of a decision, which I argued against at the time, as did Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, because we did not analytically see on the ground the conditions antecedent for the success of the surge. And the listeners should recognize, because we're at distance from all of this, it was a commitment by the President of the last combat-ready U.S. ground forces in the world, except for 2 brigade combat teams in Korea that could not be moved, and a very small residual North American combat team presence. It was, in Secretary Rice's term, a final throw of the dice. And we believed it couldn't be justified because we were not convinced the conditions were there to allow it to succeed. The president made the right decision because of factors we were unaware of at the time. That the Shia militia, the so-called Jaish al-Mahdi under Muqtada as-Sadr, had turned against confrontation with the Iraqi state and the coalition forces and was moving to a position of non-belligerency. We did not understand that in the west of the country, the so-called Anbar uprising against Sunni Islamist extremism, who had crippled their ability to live and profit, was moving forward. These two factors made the surge successful, and the surge in turn sustained and made national a development in the south with the Jaish al-Mahdi, and in the west, in the Sunni territories, with the Anbar awakening or Sunni awakening. It was the right decision to take. It was the president's to make, and he made it. The second critical thing which President Bush did was he supported the end product of a year of negotiation over the status of forces, which allowed U.S. forces, almost 130,000 at the time, to remain in Iraq and operating in Iraq beyond December 31st of 2008. It was a courageous decision by the president. It was made against the recommendation of the entire Department of Defense establishment, but it was the right decision. Not a single service person was ever taken into custody or held in the time that that status of forces agreement was in place.
Finally, where do you see Iraq today? Has the shadow of 2003 fully lifted?
No. And I would say it is not just the shadow of 2003. It is the shadow of Iraq's history since its independence, since the overthrow of the monarchy in the 50s, and the rise of Iran as an aggressive, hegemonistic force in and beyond the region. It is very much colored by the economic predation of Saddam and his ruling clique, by the destruction of institutions such as they were when the Baathists pre-Saddam came to power. It's the shadow of decades of history and experience. Has the shadow lifted somewhat? Somewhat, yes. In that, I believe Iran, facing its own internal challenges, confronted by a near unified international position about the unacceptability of its behaviors, direct U.S. cautions about the consequence of continued attacks which could produce U.S. casualties. All of that has led to a lowering, and I would call it a significant lowering, of the level of Iranian-directed, inspired, or authored violence in Iraq. But the shadow is still there, and it remains to be seen whether Iraq's politicians can find a way to move forward through the jungle of personalities, of Iranian presence, of all of the ethnic and sectarian tensions which underlie that country's past and present, to a different future place. But I see some indications which I do find encouraging, including the statements and actions of Prime Minister al-Sudani with regard to the remaining U.S. advisory presence in Iraq. It is not as good a place as a year or 18 months ago I would have expected.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Satterfield.
Thank you, Kristian. Delighted. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production was led by Kevin Young. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based at Rice University. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org.